Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Fear, and welcome to Am Haskalah's 10-part continuing education series on Reconstructing Judaism. Today's topic is Abraham Joshua Heschel in his own words, and will be led by Rabbi Steve Nathan. If you missed any of our earlier classes, I'll be putting a slew of links to the recordings in the chat, as well as a link to sign up for our emails and a link to donate to the cost of putting on today's class. We appreciate any contribution, even if it's just your presence here today. If you'd like me to email you these links instead, just message me your email address in the chat. We ask everyone to stay muted throughout and to use the raise hand function or the chat box to ask questions. The raise hand button is located under reactions on a computer and under more on a phone. If calling in from a phone, it is *6 to unmute and *9 to raise your hand. Closed captioning is enabled, and I'll put instructions in the chat. Please keep in mind that this is imperfect, especially with Hebrew. And this meeting is being recorded. And if you wish not to be seen while speaking, remember to turn off your video in advance, and that all will be shown is your screen name. And now I'll hand it over to Rabbi Nathan.
Hello, everybody. Good to see so many people here. Some I know, some I don't know. So just a little introduction to today's session. As Liz said, the subject for this 10-part series is Reconstructing Judaism Today. And it's interesting because Abraham Joshua Heschel was not a Reconstructionist. And actually, Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of Reconstructionism, was on the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary with Dr. Heschel, and they disagreed vehemently on theological issues and other issues, but they were good friends, contrary to some stories you hear. Liz, are you going to let people in that come in? Okay, great. All right. So hold on a second. Let me go to share screen here. I have too many screens to share. Hopefully this is the right one. Okay. Okay, so wait, now that I'm sharing a screen, you all disappeared. Okay, you're back. So everybody can see that picture with the quote. Our goal should be to live life in radical amazement. Get up in the morning and look at the world in a way that takes nothing for granted. Everything is phenomenal. Everything is incredible. Never treat life casually. To be spiritual is to be amazed. And in so many ways, that's the essence of who Dr. Heschel was. Never should have called him, whether to call him Rabbi Heschel or Dr. Heschel, same thing as with Dr. King, Reverend King. But so I'll go back and forth, or maybe just refer to him as Heschel. But that idea of radical amazement, that's one of my favorite phrases of his. The idea that every moment is just something, has the potential to be something totally radical, totally new, and something for us to be amazed with. And, you know, especially right now, given how this last year has been, where sometimes every moment seemed the same in some way, shape, or form, to be able to look at the world with radical amazement is truly a blessing. And in times when there's so much strife and struggle in our world, to look at the world with radical amazement, even in the face of those struggles, is a challenge, but it's really what he was all about. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And before so let me just tell you a little bit about what we're going to do here today. I was putting together a class, and I have a lot of quotes by Rabbi Heschel, and then I realized, wait a second. There's a 30-some minute video of him that was filmed a few weeks before his death, and in 1972. And it was broadcast on NBC after his death, posthumously, as you will see. And I thought, why am I teaching Heschel when we have the blessing of Heschel teaching Heschel? So what? Now, I've never really done this in an online Zoom class, so I was trying to decide, should we watch the whole thing and then go back? And I thought, you know what, we'll use the video in the same way that I would use a text. Sometimes stopping in the middle of a text and commenting on it or questioning it, sometimes just letting it go, then stopping it. And so we'll see how it works. So what I will say is if something comes up and you want to ask a question or make a comment, if you know how to use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, if you look at the bottom of your screen, I know everybody's different, but there should be something that says reactions, with a little smiley face. And if you click on reactions, you will get one of the option is raise hand. And when you raise hand, it will move you to a space up front so I can see you. And then when you're done, you just go to reaction and then click lower hands. All right. And hold on, see. Okay. There we go. Okay. Just to realize I should just spotlight me. Forgot about that. But now I'm looking at a huge picture of me, which is the last thing I want to do. Am I still spotlighted? Okay, but now I have the gallery here, so I'm not looking at a huge me. That's good. So I want to start with we'll start at the very beginning, as Hammerstein said, with a biography. So I would say Heschel was one of the dominant thinkers in American Judaism in the 20th century, excuse me, late 20th century in America, along with Mordechai Kaplan, and there were others as well. But Kaplan and Heschel were both on the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the Conservative Movement's rabbinical school. And again, Heschel, a dyed-in-the-wool mystic, and Kaplan as much a rationalist as Heschel was a mystic. And they were both thorns in the side of the administration of JTS, if you ask anyone who was there at the time. They were favorites of the students, especially Heschel. And from what I understand from people who took courses with Heschel, no matter what the course was called, it kind of became Heschel on Heschel, or Heschel on whatever he his, but that was more than enough. And he was very much a thorn in the side because he was also a very prominent war activist, Vietnam War activist. Actually, I remember my teacher, Rabbi Arthur Green, talking about being in a class with Heschel, and Heschel came in, and he was sick at the time. He had a heart condition, and that's why he died. He died very young. And Heschel basically came in and said, okay, your job today is to convince me not to go and change myself, not to come in. The mic is often static. Okay, I'll try taking you off of the headphone and putting you on my, that's weird because the headphone's usually better. But let me change the mic to, okay, is that any better? Okay, that's weird. The headphone's usually better. Okay. But now I have to move the speaker away from the headphone. Okay. Liz, can you just unmute yourself and say something so I make sure my speaker's working?
Hello.
Okay. Hello. That's good. All right. So where was I? Oh, so Heschel came into class sometime in the late 60s and said, okay, your job today is convince me not to go down to Washington and handcuff myself to the fence around the White House in protest of the war in Vietnam, which he ended up doing. He also, when Dr. King gave his speech protesting the Vietnam War at Morningside Church, that was mainly because of Heschel's doing. Dr. King was reticent to get involved in the anti-war movement because there were people in the civil rights movement that thought that might dilute the message and take people away from the civil rights message. But he felt, after discussing with Heschel, who was very strongly encouraging him to do this, that
it was connected very strongly to the civil rights movement, especially because of the number of African Americans who were serving in Vietnam and all of the problems with Vietnam. So Heschel was really responsible for that. But I got to the present without talking about the past. So he was a descendant of a preeminent rabbinic family in Europe, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, and the Apter Rebbe, who's the first Abraham Joshua, Heschel, were two of his descent. He was a descendant. Two of his ancestors. Sorry, my mind's a little fuzzy. They were both very prominent. Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev was one of the early disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. He was the youngest of six children, and in his teens, he received a traditional yeshiva education, obtained a traditional Eastern European smicha, rabbinical ordination, at the age of 16, mind you. Then he broke away from the tradition. He went to the University of Berlin, where he obtained his doctorate at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is the school for Jewish enlightenment. So that was, both those are two different things. He got his doctorate at the University of Berlin, and then he also went to the school for the Hochschule, which was the Jewish Renaissance, where he earned a second rabbinic denomination, but from the more liberal branch of Judaism in Germany. And he was the student of many famous German Jewish teachers, Albeck, Ellbogen, Gutmann, Leo Beck, and then eventually, and Martin Buber, who then made Aliyah, at which point Heschel was appointed the head of the Lehrhaus, the institute in Germany. Then, of course, the Nazis took power, and he found refuge first in England and then the United States. He was brought over in the late 30s by Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the Reform Movement's rabbinical seminary in Cincinnati. And this was an interesting challenge for him, because obviously he was not a Reform Jew. He was from the Hasidic tradition. He was traditionally observant, yet with this very liberal education. And his doctorate on the Hebrew prophets became his first book, The Prophets, which is still one of the seminal books on learning about the Hebrew prophets, not only in rabbinical schools, but in Christian seminaries all over the world. He came to Cincinnati, and there was definitely an issue there because it was in the heyday of sort of classical reform. So at the rabbinical college in Cincinnati, they didn't observe kashrut, they didn't observe traditional Shabbat, observance of Shabbat, etc. And theologically, things were it didn't fit in perfectly either. But thank God for HUC, because they not only rescued Heschel from the Nazis, but there were other scholars also that they brought in the late 30s, who probably would have perished along with so many scholars and rabbis. So he was in Cincinnati, and then eventually went to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which was a slightly better fit because it was still, JTS still saw itself and still sees itself today as a movement, as a seminary, and the conservative movement as a movement that is rooted in halakha, traditional Jewish law. And even though they're flexible and change things such as egalitarianism and openness to LGBTQ rabbis, etc., they still, in terms of practice, see themselves as a halachically observant. And so he fit better there. But again, it was in a time where mysticism was sort of out of favor, because the 20th century was all about rationalism and science. And he was not about rationalism and science. He was about the mystical connection with the divine in the universe and how our actions on earth could actually affect the divine. And you'll see in his interview. So many of the faculty members did have issues with his theology, but as I said, he became beloved of the students, and continued there, continued there until his death in 1972. He was the professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism. So they did teach mysticism, but if you talk to anybody who went to JTS in those days, mysticism was optional. Nowadays, it's part of the required curriculum, I believe. So he authored pioneering studies in modern theology, medieval Jewish philosophy, biblical and Talmudic literature. Heschel saw the teachings of the prophets, as I said earlier, as a clarion call for social action in the United States, and worked tirelessly for civil rights and against the Vietnam War. The famous picture of him marching arm in arm with Martin Luther King, which I'll show in a second, in 1965 in Selma, became a symbol of the cooperation possible both between Blacks and Jews in America, but also about the importance that Judaism needed to support the civil rights movement. And that's when he had, at the march from in Selma, that's when one of his famous quotes, he said, he felt like his legs were praying when he was on that march. So prayer for him wasn't just about davening, the traditional way of prayer, but it's also about his social action was a form of prayer for him. So just to share a few pictures, and as I said, he died in 1972 at the age of 67. To double check that, my picture was 67, of a heart attack. He had if you listen to, there are many recordings of his daughter, Dr. Susanna Heschel, a well-known Jewish feminist scholar, talking about him, and they were always concerned about his health. You know, she talks about when he would walk home from shul on Shabbat, walk home from services, and it was a long walk, and it was hot out, and they would be concerned, you know, is he going to make, you know, and is he going to get home or not? Unfortunately, it was before the time of, you know, bypasses and stents and all of those things. So just to share, just going to share a couple pictures, just so you'll get a sense of who he was. He looked a little older than he was, but this is Dr. Heschel, and I'm just trying to, did the picture change? Okay, so that's when he presented an award to Dr. King. Actually, I believe it was a few weeks before Dr. King's death, at the annual convention of the Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism, for his work, for Dr. King's work in the civil rights movement. And I had that one already, the quote. I thought I had the picture of him marching with, I'll find that later. I did have the picture of him marching in Selma, but you've probably seen the picture with that face they're all wearing leis that somebody had given them. And he was arm in arm with Dr. King, just to his right. So that's the brief introduction. Any questions at this point? If so, use the hand raising, or if you can't figure out how to do that, if your camera's on, you can raise your hand. But that's basically the biographical information. So stop share again for a second. Sorry, 1 second. I have too many windows here. I just lost my window. Sorry, my window just disappeared with the video. There it is. All right. Sorry about this. The joys of, you know, you would think we're so used to using. There, I found it. Sorry, I'm just gonna go back here. So that's the well-known picture. That is, well, there's another picture where Heschel is actually to the right of King, but here he's moved over further. And there are there's another picture with another rabbi holding a Torah. So they were very much a part of the march. So this is the video. So as I said, what I'm going to do is play it. I'll pause it at times. But again, if something comes up, if he says something that strikes you and you have a question about it or a comment about it, raise your hand. If you can't figure out how to raise your hand, because I know it is a little tricky for some people, you can put something in the chat. And Liz, if you can just keep your eye on the chat, and if you see a question pop up, just let me know. Either unmute yourself or raise your hand, okay? So this is The Eternal Light, which was back then a Sunday morning TV show on NBC. I think it was on like 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Some of you may remember it. Oh wait, I have to make sure that I am sharing my audio. Hold on one second. Okay, wait, hold on one second. I just want to make sure that I'm sharing this right, because otherwise you won't be able to hear it. Okay, good, it's set. All right, everybody can see it again? Just nod, okay, here we go.
Was there in your life, especially your early life?
Let me just start for a second.
I brought these books from home. They're only a small portion of the books you've written. What was there in your life, especially your early life, that would give you the thoughts to fill so many books?
Hard work, training, and a good environment. I was very fortunate in having lived as a child and as a young boy in an environment where there were many people I could revere, people concerned with problems of inner life, of spirituality, of integrity, people who have shown great compassion and understanding for other people.
But your life itself has not been an easy life. You escaped from Poland just before the Nazis came in. What experiences of life have found their way into these books?
I would say, again, my background, my early upbringing. I would criticize my early upbringing as deficient in one respect and very rich in another respect. Deficient in what is maybe called the art of relaxation, sports. I'm not the sporting type, unfortunately, but very rich in moments of exaltation. This enabled me to stand a little bit above the circumstances of life and to take a perspective from which I could see the world, so to speak, from a higher point of view. In other words, I was trained as a child to live a life, or to strive to live a life which is compatible with the mystery and marvel of human existence.
And learning about it. What is the role? What is the role of learning?
The role of learning was decisive. First of all, the supreme value ascribed to learning, and learning being a source of...
Sorry, I meant to pause him for a second. But again, I know he's got a fairly thick accent, and I actually tried using the CC function on YouTube, and because of his accent, it was constantly putting up the wrong words. But this idea of viewing the world from a place of exaltation, from looking down on the world, not looking down on the world or looking down on people in a pejorative way, but that he had this view of the world around him. And I love when he talks about the fact that, the one way that it was deficient was he never learned how to relax. He never, he wasn't the sporty type, as he says. He never had the chance he never learned how to play sports or even just relax. And yet, on the other hand, he was being steeped in this tradition at a very young age. Remember, he was ordained as a rabbi at 16. And I should also, so that means he probably started studying when he was, who knows. But the other thing I should say that's really amazing about his book, I've loved his books ever since I first started reading them in college, maybe even in high school. Not that I always understood them, and I always needed a thesaurus with me, but which was fascinating because English, he wrote in English, it wasn't translated, and English was, his native languages were Yiddish, Polish, then German, and Hebrew, then German, and then English was the fifth language that he learned. So it was his fifth language, and yet he wrote in English in a way that so many people, such as myself, who are native English speakers, could never write with that kind of eloquence. Okay.
Inspiration learning being the greatest adventure, learning being a source of joy, and in fact, learning for the purpose of discovering of the importance of self-discipline. The realization, namely, that a life without discipline was not worth living.
Perhaps a life without surprise is not worth living either. You recently told an interviewer that what keeps me alive is my ability to be surprised. What has surprised you lately?
Everything. This may be my weakness. You know, you quoted once a statement from the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, and I disagree with that statement. I would say there's nothing stale under the sun, except human beings who become stale. I try not to be stale, and everything is new. No two moments are alike, and a person who thinks that two moments are alike has never lived. The secret of it is a very profound principle in philosophy, and that I would call the sense for the unique. Do you know that among 1 billion faces in this world, no two faces are alike? The other day, a person complained to me. He went to the Metropolitan Art Museum, and he was bewildered because no two paintings looked alike.
One of the most arresting titles of your many books would be this one, God in Search of Man. Is God in search of man?
It's a paradox. In fact, if God would consult me, I would tell him...
Does he?
He doesn't. He's too wise to consult me. I would say, why do you care about man? The biggest message of the Bible, of the prophets of Israel, is that God takes men seriously. You remember he created Adam and Eve, and they immediately failed. He was disappointed, but he kept them alive. Then they gave birth to 2 boys, very nice boys. I'm sure they got some very excellent education in a private school, or in a public school, I'm not sure, but certainly in a good environment. They didn't live in the slums, you know. And you know what one brother did to the other? God should have been disgusted. He said, no, I will keep the human species alive. I'm waiting. Maybe someday there will be a righteous generation. And throughout history, seen by the Bible, there's one disappointment for God after another, and he's still waiting for mankind which will live by justice and compassion. He's in search of men. Now let me say to you, there are essentially 3 points. 1, God in search of men to me is a summary of all of the Hebrew Bible. 2, it expresses the idea of Judaism about the position of man in the universe. Man is terribly important. If God is so concerned about men, which surprises me again, why shouldn't God be concerned more about, let us say, cosmic energy or the astronaut techniques? He's interested about widows and orphans in Jerusalem. My Lord, if he were to ask me, I would say it's beneath your dignity. You, God of the universe, should be concerned about the poor, about the disadvantaged. Yes, he is. Man is very important to God.
And the third point?
The third point would be the nature of religion. The nature of religion is not just a longing and feeling of man searching for God. I think that God is more in search of men than man is in search of God. He gives us no rest. We have for generations, for decades, for centuries, tried to refute the existence of God, as if he didn't exist. And in spite of everything, man is still searching. Man is still waiting. Man is still longing. Man has discovered and is discovering that a man without God is like a torso, a body without a head. In this...
But man is searching also because, if you'll forgive me, there's a certain absurdity, a certain purposelessness, or perhaps undiscoverable purpose. Let me cite an example. 10 days before Martin Luther King was killed, you, as a good friend of his, addressed a convention of the Rabbinical Assembly, and you said, Martin Luther King is a sign that God has not forsaken the United States of America. And that 10 days later, he was dead in the most cruel and purposeless fashion. It's that sort of question that challenges faith. How do you explain that?
If we understand the Bible properly, and very few people these days study the Bible properly, we atomize the Bible, we tear it to pieces. Instead of immersing in the thoughts of the Bible, you discover that God shares life with man, and he has given men freedom, a very questionable gift, and the most outstanding gift man has. men can do anything. When the first son of the first couple decided to murder his brother, he did what he pleased, and God did not interfere.
But that raises the question, though. If you're saying that if God were to control every aspect of man's life, it would not be living, then that raises the question, why pray to God then? If God is not going to interfere, if God is not going to intervene, if God is not going to help, what is the role of prayer?
Pausing here for a second. I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts about that, because what he's saying here, again, the idea that God, and again, the gendered language of its time, God is in search of human beings even more than, or in need of human beings even more than human beings are in need of God. You know, if it's the, you know, if a tree falls in a forest, you know, if you know, that idea of does it exist? If there's nobody that needs God, does God exist? Is one way of putting it. But this idea that, you know, as he put it, it's about free will, that Judaism has this belief that all is determined, and yet we have free will, which is, again, this paradox. And Maimonides talks about the fact that, well, what's determined is the different options that, you know, we know that person A will do X, Y, or Z, but it's up to person A to decide what they're going to do. But it really addresses the question. And again, remember, he's speaking not only after the Holocaust, but after surviving, being rescued, and the remainder of his family being murdered by the Nazis, still saying, I believe in God. And it's not about, as some theologians might say, it's not about God punishing human beings. And there are Holocaust survivors who will even say that this was part of God's plan, and I can't understand it. It's just like when there's a tragic death in a family, I would never say to somebody, this is part of God's plan, or even that person is in a better place, because I don't know if that's the person's own theology. If the person expresses it themselves, I will support it, even though I don't necessarily believe it, because I think that's my job as a rabbi. But, you know, so there are people who survived the Shoah who said that they thought it was part of God's plan, that it was punishment for whatever transgressions existed, that people were abandoning Judaism. That idea of God is certainly not what I feel, but it's also not what Heschel is saying. And Liz is waving her hand. I assume that means that there is a comment. No comment in this chat. Okay.
Just someone walking in the room.
I have a,
Oh, okay.
Actually, sorry, Joy has a comment.
Oh, okay. Hi, Joy.
hi, Rabbi Steve. I do have a comment. When we think about things like the diaspora, like the Holocaust, does it necessarily have to correlate to sins, or could it be that, in my view, these things happen so future generations, it makes them better people?
Well, so that's a very, I would say that's an existentialist way of looking at it, that you're giving it meaning, not that there was meaning that preceded it. It wasn't so much that God did this in order to teach us, but okay, this happened, what can we learn from it?
Exactly.
And what he's saying is, you know, it happened because God gave us free will, however one understands that, and which he said is the greatest gift, and yet on the other hand, not such a great gift. And people have the ability to choose evil, just as Cain did. So it's about human choice ultimately. You know, we could study history and we'll see the choices that human beings made along the way that brought about the Holocaust. It was people choosing evil. It was people separating themselves from the divine and choosing evil instead. But so his question here was why pray? You know, if God, you know, if God isn't going to do things in that way, if God isn't going to prevent the Holocaust, etc. Why bother praying to God? So I'm curious if, before we hear his answer, if anybody here would like to address that that question. Why pray? Or why do you pray? Carol, if you could unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I think the answer to that I normally give is that praying strengthens us. Praying enhances our commitment, our resolution, and gives us a sense of community and support, whether that be real or not. It helps us, and it's a good reason to be praying.
Okay, that somehow praying or connecting to the divine, however you want to look at it, it benefits us, and it also helps bring people together in community.
Right.
Okay. Just make sure to go back down to your. There we go. You put your hand down. Thank you. Any other thoughts before we hear what Dr. Heschel has to say? Okay, let's hear his response.
First of all, let us not misunderstand the nature of prayer, particularly in Jewish tradition. The primary purpose of prayer is not to make requests. The primary purpose of prayer is to praise, to sing, to chant. Because the essence of prayer is a song, and men cannot live without a song. Prayer may not save us, but prayer may make us worthy of being saved.
Just have to pause. That is one of my favorite quotes of his, that prayer may not save us, but it might make us worthy of being saved. And that the essence, in prayer in Judaism, there are three types. There are prayers of petition where we ask for something, but he's saying the primary purpose of prayer is to praise and to sing. Julia, you have a comment? Unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I think that it's important to have the intention or the kavanah, because what we put our attention on, that is what's going to grow, and that's what's going to expand. So that's what makes us worthy, the desire to be closer to God.
Exactly. And I think he would agree with that. Desire to bring ourselves closer to God, to connect with God, helps to do that in a community, helps to change us as individuals and as a community and make us worthy of saving. Thank you. Just make sure to take your hand down. Thank you.
We also have a quick comment in the chat from Virginia Levin. This is what
Okay.
I've been trying to figure out. Now we have been apart, so I don't have the reason of getting together in community.
Well, right now, that's a good point. I think, right now, this is the community that we have. I know it's not perfect. A Zoom community is not the same as an in-person community. And yet, I would say that it is possible to create community virtually, if that's the only option that you have. So but it's definitely more difficult. I mean, especially prayer. I don't find prayer nearly as meaningful on Zoom as I do in person. And yet still we're connecting right now, especially if I told everybody to turn their cameras on, which you don't have to at this point. But if you were, you can create that connection as part of the prayer experience. But it's definitely more of a challenge. So again, that last quote, that prayer may not save us, but prayer may make us worthy of saving.
Prayer is not requesting. There is a partnership of God and man. God needs our help. I would define man as a divine need. God is in need of man. In history, he cannot do the job alone because he gave us freedom. And the whole hope of messianic redemption depends on God and on man. We must help him. And by each deed we carry out, we either retard or accelerate the coming of redemption. Our role in history is tremendous. I mean, our human role. Absurdity, yes, plays a major role. In fact, it's the greatest challenge to existence, not only to religion, the greatest challenge to all activities. To political activity, to economic activity, to all idea of progress is the encounter with absurdity. And if I were to be asked, what is the meaning of God? a difficult question to answer in one sentence.
Well, I'll ask you, what is the meaning of God?
I would have to use a number of sentences. One, the certainty that there is a meaning beyond a mystery, that holiness conquers absurdity. And without holiness, we will sink in absurdity.
Where is holiness? Is it what's in the Bible? Is that where one finds holiness?
I don't believe in monopoly. I think God loves all men and has given many nations, has given all men an awareness of his greatness and of his love. And God is to be found in many hearts all over the world, not limited to one nation or to one people, to one religion. But I have to understand again, to come back to the problem of uniqueness. What has the Hebrew Bible given us in particular that's not to be found anywhere else? I would say that particular appreciation of the greatness of man, of man's tremendous potentiality as a partner of God. This idea, to me, is not to be found anywhere else.
But is that potential of being fulfilled? We talked a moment ago about Martin Luther King. You've been active in the civil rights movement since, I guess, the early 60s. You marched at Selma with Dr. King. I think it's fair to say, though, that you've written about the monstrosity of inequality. I think that's the expression you use. I think it's fair to say that in the past few years that the American community has hardened its attitude toward equality in jobs, housing, schools, and so on. How is that carrying out a potential?
You know, they have to tell you that life is a drama. They have to tell you that we are not in the midst of an automatic progressive development of humanity. There are ups and downs. At this very moment, there's a down. There's a depression. There is a renewal of prejudice, which is a poison. As a person committed to biblical faith, I would say what keeps humanity alive is the certainty that we have a Father. But then I also have to remember that God is either the Father of all men or of no men. And the idea of judging a person in terms of black or brown or white is an eye disease.
You've also said that you're an optimist against your better judgment.
Yeah.
But you're still an optimist.
I'm still an optimist.
You first gained prominence as a scholar writing about the prophets. Is it possible for a modern prophet to come to us? Or is that just pre-biblical?
Again, Mr. Stern, your questions are very rich and very complex and very meaningful. And since time is so limited and precious, I will have to give you short answers and only partial answers. The idea of a prophet is complex and consists above all of two things, of the message or the substance of what the prophet has to say, and of some extraordinary claim to an experience which is not given to other men. Let us ignore the second, let us take the first. What's so great about the message of the prophet? About the prophet as a character. I would say the prophet is a man who is able to hold God and man in one thought at one time, at all times. This is so great and this is so marvelous, which means that whatever I do to man, I do to God. When I hurt a human being, I injure God. Now, their thoughts, their message continues to be so relevant today that I venture to say, and I had this experience with many distinguished philosophers when we got together to discuss social contemporary problems, that the ultimate source of hope for all of us, whether it was a Protestant or a Catholic or a secular philosopher, was suddenly our reliance on a hope uttered by the prophets of Israel. Therefore, I would say the spirit of the prophet, the message of the prophet is very much alive. It's a kind of men who combined very deep love with very powerful dissent, painful rebuke with unwavering hope. The prophet, as a witness to that great mystery, or to what I would call meaning beyond the mystery, namely God, could still be alive and should serve as an example.
Are you talking about a rebirth of their knowledge in the mouths of others, or is that not to be?
No, an identification. May I make a personal statement here? I've written a book on the prophets, a rather large book, spent many years. And then really this book changed my life. Because early in my life, my great love was learning, study. And the place where I preferred to live was my study, in books, and writing, and thinking. I've learned from the prophets that I have to be involved in the affairs of men, in the affairs of suffering men. And I would like to say that one of the saddest things about contemporary life in America is that the prophets are unknown. There's a complete decline of the Bible in an American education. No one knows the prophets. There are countless intellectuals who may be great authorities on literature. I've never read the prophets really, never been touched by them. And this, I'm sorry to say, is a little bit of a disaster. The great examples we need today are the ancient prophets of Israel. I say that this book on the prophets which I wrote changed my life. And I think that anybody who reads the prophets will discover, number one, that the prophets were the most disturbing people who've ever lived. Yeah? It's not easy to read.
You mean and they were abrasive when you say disturbing?
Abrasive, disturbing, giving me a bad conscience.
Well, are you a prophet? You've been abrasive at times, particularly concerning the Vietnam War. You've said a great deal about that.
I wouldn't accept this praise, because it's enough for me to say that I am a descendant of the prophets, which is an old Jewish statement. It is a claim almost arrogant enough to say that I am a descendant of the prophets, what is called B'nai Nevi'im. So let us hope and pray that I'm worthy of being a descendant of the prophets.
You said during the height of the agitation over the Vietnam War that it was the great religious issue. What made the Vietnam War a religious issue?
Of course it's a religious issue. What does God demand of us primarily? Justice and compassion. What does he condemn above all? Murder. Killing innocent people. How can I pray when I have on my conscience the awareness that I am co-responsible for the death of innocent people in Vietnam? In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible.
At this time, 1 year ago, I was covering a trial.
Muted.
Forgot I muted myself. So I just want to stop there because that's another essential quote of his. In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And I think, he said that especially with regard to the Vietnam War. But also, I think he also used it in terms of the civil rights movement. And I think it's very true today. So often, people will say, well, I'm not responsible for racism in the United States. I'm not guilty of racism, excuse me. But we're not guilty necessarily. Maybe one never did anything intentionally racist in their life, but we're all responsible. We're responsible for the continuation of the system, the racist system, and we're responsible for trying to bring an end to racism. That's just one example. So every one of us is responsible for the world. And again, that partnership between God and human beings is very much a mystical, not only mystical, it predates mysticism. It's even in the pre-mystical rabbinic writings that God and human beings are partners in creation, each and every day. So that idea of we may not be guilty, but we're all responsible is really essential. Let's go back just a drop here.
How can I pray when I have on my conscience the awareness that I am co-responsible for the death of innocent people in Vietnam? In a free society, some are guilty, all are responsible.
At this time, 1 year ago, I was covering a trial of priests and nuns, the Berrigan Trial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Prospective jurors, one after another, when being questioned by the judge and lawyers, said they thought it was wrong for clergymen to be involved in politics, that their job is to administer to spiritual needs. Why don't you stick to spiritual needs?
It's a very good statement. In fact, it's such a good statement that if the prophets were alive, they would be already sent to jail by these jurors, because the prophets mixed into social, political issues. And frankly, I would say that God seems to be an unreligious person, because if you read the words of God in the Bible, he always mixes in politics and in social issues.
So since there's a quick short break here, Irene, did you have a question? Unmute yourself. There we go.
I'm from the north of England. You know, I'm very interested in Heschel. So I remember the Vietnam War because I'm old enough. I wanted to ask you something, it might be very, very difficult for you, but it's really important in this country. He also mentioned that the color of one's skin is irrelevant. But we, unlike in America, we have an official church. We have an official church which has now pronounced from the archbishops that Jesus is black. This came out to do with the George Floyd. Not that he's not white or that he's Semitic, but he's black. And they're also using anti-Semitic tropes. That's something I teach about. So I don't want to judge what's going on in America, but it's quite worrying for us here. And Martin Luther King also said, that very famous speech, about don't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the quality, I don't know the exact quote, the quality of their character. And that seems to have disappeared in 60 or 50 or 60 years now in this country. And I think it might be even worse in the USA from what I've seen, but I don't want to judge. And I don't know what denomination you are, as a rabbi, but I think it's quite worrying that this is going on. And none of the rabbis here dare to say anything because they don't want to be accused of being racist themselves.
That's a tricky one because you brought in a lot of different issues here, and we could digress and really just focus on this. But I think what he's saying, and I think what King said as well. Well, I think if Heschel were still alive today, I think in the 60s there was this idea of being colorblind, that there's no difference. Whereas, and he says that the idea of seeing somebody black, brown, white is an eye disease. So what I would say in this day and age, it's really about, it's not about anymore just looking at everybody as they're the same, but acknowledging that everybody is different, and that's perfectly fine. Whether you're black, whether you're brown, whether you're white, whether you're Jewish, whether you're Christian, whether you're Muslim, etc., that it's not about everybody's supposed to be the same. It's that everybody's supposed to be different, but everyone is equal. As he said, if God is not, if God isn't everyone's God, then God is no one's God. And I don't know that I can directly speak to what the bishops in England have said, because as you're not as familiar with what's going on over here, I'm not as familiar with what goes on over there. But I think it is, the truth is, if we look at Jesus and if we look at even the prophets, we don't portray our prophets. We don't generally portray Moses. We don't have icons and figures in the way that Christianity does. But if we did, if they were white the way Jesus looks white in medieval Christian paintings, I would say no, they're in the Middle East. Nobody back then nobody who is a native of that part of the world is going to be white. But I think that the idea is that we're all equal. And unfortunately, some of the teachings that would normally point to that are also being used in racist or anti-Semitic ways. And like I said, I think that's a whole other issue that I don't feel, I think it would take us, but not only that it would take us in a whole other direction, but also I don't feel like that's something that I can respond to in that moment, but I appreciate you bringing it up. but that, that he was not, if he were around today and looking at the Middle East or any of or racism today, again, I think he would say, God is everybody's God. We are all equal in God's sight. It doesn't say that that Jews were created in the image of God. We're all created in the image of God. And that's something that often gets forgotten within every religious belief. All right, I'm gonna continue here.
That is the wonder of it, the torment that man has, the problem-solving machine that he is. That, you think, is, I detect, is the essence of living a human life.
Yes, you see, and that is true. No, but you see, one of the great sins of contemporary education is to give the impression you can solve all problems, or there are no problems. Actually, the greatness of man is that he faces problems. I would judge a person by how many deep problems he's concerned with.
But is not the quest of religion, though, to give one a sense of inner peace?
Now, you have to understand the meaning of inner peace. Let me give you first an example of a person who has no problems. Let me give you a dramatic, fictitious picture. Here stands a man, and I'll tell you, this is a man who has no problems. Do you know why? He's an idiot. Because a man has problems. And the more complicated, the richer he is, the deeper are his problems. This is our distinction: to have problems, to face problems. Life is a challenge, not just a satisfaction. And the calamity of our time is to reduce life to pleasure only. I'm not against pleasure, but the greatness of life is experience and facing a challenge rather than just having satisfaction. I would be frightened if I were to be ruled by a person who is satisfied, who has the answers to everything. In a very deep sense, religion has two things. First of all, it's an answer to the ultimate problems of human existence. And it also has another side. It is a challenge to all answers. It is living in this polarity of these 2 points.
But there are so many religions that say, come to us and you will have no problem. We will solve your problems. Here's the word of God. He will solve your problem. You don't accept that.
No, I don't accept it because it contradicts everything I have learned about life, from experience, from philosophy, from history, from the Bible. If I look at the Bible, God is full of problems. Imagine, he created man. He created man on his own will, out of his own freedom. And man is a problem to him. Look at the Bible. God is always wrestling with the problem of man. Even God has problems. This is a deep ingredient of existence, problems. And the tragedy of our education today is we are giving such easy solutions. Be complacent, have peace of mind, everything is fine. No, wrestling is the issue. Facing the challenge is the issue.
Would it be a better world if we were all of one religion?
No.
Would there be less strife?
No. As far as I can judge, and I try to judge God's will from history, it seems to be the will of God that there would be more than one religion. I think it's a very marvelous thing to realize. You know, if I were to ask the question, whether the example I think I gave you before, whether the Metropolitan Museum should try to introduce that all paintings should look alike, or I should like to suggest that all human faces should look alike, how would you respond to my proposal?
I would be against it.
I'm glad. We agree.
I think also, though, in your writings, you've indicated that even where one religion has been adopted in the state, there's no evidence that has brought any happiness or any new high points of religious feeling. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I think it is the will of God that there should be religious pluralism. One of the most important things in life a human being faces is not only to know how to build a machine, but also how to overcome envy. It's an irrational, destructive power in every man. What does the school do about it? The secular school? Nothing. So I'm disappointed. The American educational system, on all levels, has proved to be a terrible disappointment. Religious schools, it's a new problem. I only wish I could tell you the religious schools are doing a perfect job. I would say religious schools should deserve support because they are doing partly a good job. They at least teach people some of the great classical ideas of the religious tradition, and we cannot live without religious tradition. Because take away the religious tradition, what is left? You know what is left? Read contemporary literature and give the contemporary literature, the novels, as a source of inspiration for our young people. What will they get? The Psalms, no one reads. You're not allowed to read the Psalms in the school. How can you be human without being able to pray? We need religious education. The problem begins whether religious education is in such a splendid state. It isn't, but a separate problem. I think that aid to religious schools in some form that would not contradict the constitutional regulations would in the long run prove a blessing. The original fear of supporting religious schools was because religion was a tremendous power at that time. A power we were afraid of that would compete with the state, with the idea of equality. By now, religions are so weak in America. There's little to be afraid of religious power. Therefore, I would definitely say aid for religious schools in some form would be a great contribution.
You believe that organized religion is in a weakened condition?
I think so, but we have to put the blame not only on the religious people, on the religious establishment, but also on the people who belong to that establishment, on the members, on the plain people. You see, actually, the role of religion has declined as a result of countless assaults from all directions. So what is the outcome? In the past, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, a parent who had a gifted boy had a great dream. His son should be a rabbi, a minister, a priest. Today, a man who is a gifted boy would like him to be a doctor of medicine, a banker, a lawyer. So the gifted boys are being kept away by many people, blame the people. But the religious leaders are to blame. There is a decline in religious thinking, religious passion, a detachment from the real problems. Let me say to you the following. The central problem in the Bible is not God but man. The Bible is a book about men, rather than man's book about God. And the great problem is how to answer, to respond to the human situation. And somehow, religious leaders have often become petrified in their own traditions and understanding and couldn't relate to the burning issues of the day.
How is it responding today?
How is it responding today? Not too well. A great many religious leaders have given up faith altogether. They are deluding themselves. As I told you before, self-deception is a major passion in human life. There are a great many people who use the word God and don't believe in it. Let me give you an example. One of the most popular definition of God, common in America today, was developed by a great Protestant theologian. God is the ground of being. So everybody's ready to accept it. Why not? Ground of being causes me no harm. Let there be a ground of being. Doesn't cause me any harm. I'm ready to accept it. It's meaningless. Isn't there a God who is above the ground? Maybe God is the source of qualms and of disturbing my conscience. Maybe God is a God of demands. Yeah, this is God, not the ground of being. The result is we have religious institutions without a religious belief. We have a wave of non-belief. I have suddenly discovered that William James was not right when he spoke about, he was right, by the way. I'm saying it rhetorically. There is a will to believe, but there's today a will to disbelieve, and that will is very powerful. To this very day, our young people are craving for some deeper meaning. Our young people are craving for a religious outlook, and what they get is stone and not bread.
Well, what you've said, though, is that there's something more than relevance needed. That's an overused expression. You use the term in your writings, validity. Religion must have validity. What makes a religion valid?
No, if it is true, if it is it corresponds to real urgencies and questions and problems. Let me give you an example of what I mentioned to you before. Our entire civilization today revolves around one idea, interest or need. And we are taught the greatest thing in life is to satisfy one's needs and interests. Actually, our way of living revolves around one principle, self-interest, self-interest. There's nothing else but self-interest. This is a fallacy, according to religion, and religion is right, valid. Because if everything is self-interest, then there is no love. Can you imagine humanity without love? If love is only self-interest, then love is a fake, pretense.
You're telling me of the nature of man, not the nature of God, aren't you?
Yes, the nature of God is that man should have ends, not only needs. The difference between an animal and a man is not the needs. Animal has needs, man has needs too. But man, in addition to needs, has to have ends, goals to strive for. The great task of religion is to teach men how to convert ends into needs. But what we do instead is to convert needs into ends. And needs are unreliable as a standard because some needs are authentic, some needs are false. Look at advertisement. Advertisement is trying to evoke in us needs which we are not in need of. Can you imagine a day will come when I will feel all of a sudden I couldn't live without color television. Television is not enough, it has to be a color television. I will give away the last penny I have because advertisement has convinced me that without color television, I couldn't survive, right? And a million other things. I have to have at least a summer home and a winter home because without a winter home and a summer home, I'm not a respectable citizen.
I can't, when I was listening to this a couple days ago, I've seen it many times, but I kept thinking, what would he say today about our society and the idea of needs? The idea that, when he says that animals have needs as well as human beings have needs, it's about the ends, not the means, which is, it's interesting because I don't think he's not saying the ends justify the means, because maybe at times they do. But what he's saying is that the means have to be towards an end. It's not just about enjoying life. It's not just about having things, but it's about what is the end? What is the end game? What is the again? This is, as Liz reminded me, he studied existentialism with who did he study? Was it Rosenzweig? Soloveitchik. He studied. So this idea of religious so often people think of existentialism, they think of Sartre and people like that who are atheistic existentialists. But the idea of religious existentialism, that we have to create from our experience, we have to find or create meaning in our lives. So what he's saying is whatever we do has to be towards an end, something that is about meaning and not just about ourselves either. Because as he said, if it's only about the self, then there's no love in the world. And if love is one of the central principles of Judaism and religions in general, you can't have love if it's only about the self. Because self-love isn't really, self-love alone is, I just want to say this carefully, because one should love oneself. Because we said, you should love your neighbor as yourself. But it's not saying you should only love yourself. It's saying you have to love yourself first, yes, but then it has to lead you towards love of others. It's sort of when I teach meditation and mindfulness, sometimes people will say, well, but it's all about self-exploration and me, and how am I feeling and having compassion on yourself. Yes, but it's only supposed to give you the ground, the basis for which to then turn it outwards. Compassion on the self should then lead one to compassion towards others in a meditative practice. So I think that's, I think he would, and again, coming from the mystical tradition, there's a long tradition of meditation and meditative practices within the Hasidic tradition. So I'm sure he has that in his roots. So that's very much a part. Let's see, there's about Okay, good. We have about 10 minutes left on the tape and about 15 minutes left on our session. So I'm going to just let it keep playing at this point, and then we'll wrap up with any comments or questions at the end, because I do want to make sure we hear the entire recording.
I read it in an advertisement. So it becomes a need. Religion says no. Man's distinction is to live by ends and for ends and goals, and not only satisfy needs. I am not against satisfaction of needs. That's a necessary function of man. We have to satisfy our authentic needs. It's very important. We are against asceticism. We love life, but there are also ends and goals to be served. And this is the difference between animal and man. But ask an average man, what are your goals in life? He'll tell you, life insurance, a Cadillac, and color television.
You wrote a volume entitled Who is Man? You dealt with some of these questions. Is there anything else you want to add to your definition?
Oh, out of pain and anguish I wrote that book, because I consider man to be left without friends in the world. Wherever I look, books I read, it's full of contempt for the nature of man. The naked ape, man is all violent, man is essentially an animal. America spends hundreds of millions of dollars to study the behavior of animals in order to understand man, because essentially man is an animal. And I'm asking you, what a bigger insult is it to man to say that man is essentially a beast, except he has the ability to make tools, so to speak? My definition of an ape is a human being without the ability to speak. Just as well as to say that man is an animal with the ability to speak. No, what I try to do in this book is to counter, to fight the ongoing dehumanization of man, which I see in every step everywhere. Unless I feel that my life is accountable to him who is much greater than I am, I could not always control my mean leanings. I would not only be ready for self-sacrifice, number one. Number two, my life would be poor. The deepest passion in any real human person is a craving for meaning of existence. What kind of meaning of existence can I find in the fact that I can make a few dollars? That I have a little success? Here I am, and tomorrow I'm gone. What's the meaning of everything? What's the meaning of our society? What's the meaning of our world? God is the meaning beyond absurdity. Wherever I go, I encounter absurdity.
Consistent with the Jewish faith, you never write much, in fact, I don't recall you writing at all about a life hereafter. Lots of religions are predicated on the idea of salvation rather than this earthly existence. You don't talk about that sort of thing. Why is that?
Actually, I did write an essay on this problem, which I read at an international conference on death, etc., in Florence about 3 years ago. But frankly, I'll give you the real answer. We believe in an afterlife, but we have no information about it.
And therefore you can't write about it?
Can I write about it in terms of belief?
Or expectation? Or hope?
I did.
Or...
I did.
But you think that's less important than life on earth?
I think that's God's business, what to do with me after life. Here, it's my business what to do with my life. So I leave it to him. I am so busy trying to live a good life and don't always succeed. I have no time to worry what God is going to do with me once I'm in the grave. Who knows what he wants to expect me to be doing in the grave?
And through all of this, I find its uniqueness in your feelings of a collaborative effort between God and man.
Yes.
It's a sharing.
Yes.
It's a powerful concept. I'm not sure I know how we can help God.
You see, there is an old idea in Judaism found in the Bible, strongly developed by the rabbis, and very little known. And that is that God suffers when man suffers. There's a very famous text that says, even when a criminal is hanged, the gallows, God cries. He says, woe unto me. He is very unhappy when man is hanged. There is this great sympathy of God and part of man. God identifies himself with the misery of man. I can help him by reducing human suffering, human anguish, and human misery.
We have just about a minute or so left. I should say at the start of this hour, before we began this hour, Dr. Heschel indicated an interest in directing a message at young people, and I don't know that I ever in the past hour gave you the chance I promised you that I would give you.
I would say to young people a number of things, and I have only 1 minute. I would say let them remember that there is a meaning beyond absurdity. Let them be sure that every little deed counts, that every word has power, and that we can do everyone our share to redeem the world, in spite of all absurdities and all the frustration, all disappointments. And above all, remember that the meaning of life is to build life as if it were a work of art. You're not a machine. When you are young, start working on this great work of art called your own existence. And the best way, and one of the ways of doing it, or two ways of doing it, is one, remember the importance of self-discipline. Second, study the great sources of wisdom. Don't read the bestsellers. And third, remember that life is a celebration, or can be a celebration. There's much of entertainment in our life. And entertainment is destroying much of our initiative. It weakens our imagination. What's really important is life as celebration. In a very deep sense, I would say that the addiction, the drug addiction, which so many people suffer, is due to the fact that man cannot live such a shallow life, stale. He needs exaltation. He needs moments of celebration. One of the most important things is to teach men how to celebrate life.
You talked earlier of slanders. May I give you an example of something which is not a slander? Perhaps the most astute comment on your work was made by Professor Marty of the University of Chicago, and he said Rabbi Heschel's work, unlike other philosophers, is directed not only at the mind, but at the heart and the will. I couldn't have said it so perceptively. Thank you very much for being with us.
The Eternal Light, the NBC television religious program, has presented a conversation with the late Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel, taped shortly before his death. This program is dedicated to his memory. Dr. Heschel was professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and a distinguished author, lecturer, philosopher, and activist. Dr. Heschel's humanity and love of life is his legacy to us and can serve as an inspiration for all of us to follow. Dr. Heschel spoke with Carl Stern, NBC News United States Supreme Court correspondent. This special Eternal Light program was brought to you in association with the Jewish
I mean, there's not much left to say. Just to tell you a little bit as we close, sort of how I came to Heschel well before I became a rabbinical student. When I was a child growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, our rabbi, who I didn't particularly like, was very dry and did not know how to relate to children, and gave very long sermons. The only time I remember being drawn into his sermons was when he would talk about his teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, and he would quote him. And then my ears would perk up because I started to hear these thoughts and these words. And so when I was in college, but I may still have been in high school, I picked up a small collection of his work. Wasn't God in Search of Man? It was Man's Quest for God, or Just Quest for God, I think it's called. It's a great place to start. And there are a few different books that are snippets, that are anthologies of little pieces of his work. So if you don't feel like you're ready to jump into God in Search of Man or any of his other books that are in print, those are great things to do. There are also lots of quotes on the website, on various websites. So, this idea of what it means to be human and what it means to be in partnership with God, and that what we do does affect the divine. However one chooses to view God, even if it's a non-supernatural way, that somehow our actions affect the universe, and that we must celebrate, we must rejoice, and we must work hard to make the world a better place. That's really kind of what it comes down to oversimplify it. We have one more session on July 11th, I think, Sunday, whatever that Sunday is. And I'm going to look at a little bit at comparing some of Heschel's writings with Mordechai Kaplan's writings. Again, the mystical versus the rational, and yet, so I'm a Reconstructionist, which tends to be rational, but I always consider myself a mystical Reconstructionist, because the words of mysticism and Kabbalah and Hasidut really speak to me a lot more than some of the more intellectual words, and yet I don't think the two are, I think the two can be synthesized in a way. Any last, yeah, he was an amazing human being. And there's some wonderful video clips, not only of Heschel, well, there's not many clips of Heschel, but there are clips about his daughter Susanna, Dr. Susanna Heschel, talking about his life. And actually, I think she just recently published a book about him. But go to Google, and you can find lots of different interesting things about Heschel by other people as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I wanted to point out that I did put the link in the chat if you'd like to sign up for the next installment that's on Kaplan and Heschel together and their influence on the 20th century Judaism. And I want to thank everyone for being here today.
Thanks, everyone.